Hi guys, and welcome back to another video. Now originally I filmed a long video of me disassembling it in detail, but looking at the footage it's a bit long, it's a bit boring, and my commentary's not very good because I was 8 hours in at that point and I wasn't really making sense. So I thought I'd refilm it. All the parts are laid out on the bench, and I'm going to show you all the insides of the engine, and maybe you guys can give me your opinion, your diagnosis down in the comments. Yeah, let's have a look at the engine. So I thought I'd start with the spark plugs, since that was one of the first things to be removed from the engine. They all look a similar colour, but this one looks a little bit lighter. Now, the piston ringland failed before the engine was rebuilt, and that might have something to do with it, because a lean engine detonates, and when an engine detonates, it can crack a piston. And looking at that spark plug, the colour on it, it looks a little bit leaner than the other three. Generally on a turbocharged car, you usually see darker plugs. Anyway, that's just speculating. Let's have a look at the crankshaft, the first one. The cam lobes, we don't see much wear. We can have a good look at them. Not a lot of wear, just some oil staining, which is pretty normal. Seems to be the case on every camshaft I've ever looked at. But when we have a little bit of a closer inspection, these sort of surfaces that would be in contact with the head, I'm not sure if I'm imagining this, but there seems to be a little bit of scoring there. Now that could be caused by metal particulates sort of floating around when the bottom end was failing and being squirted through these holes. They're not like terrible, but I can feel that. And a rule of thumb with these, let's use my thumb then, if you can feel it, it's too deep. So these cams are going to have to be repolished, most likely. I can feel a rough surface, but that's very bad, that one. Can you hear that? So yeah, that could just be 24 years of wear, or it could be a sign of something else. Now my theory I'll be giving you towards the end. You have a think and let me know what you think as we go around the engine. Now looking at this camshaft as well. Rough, that's too rough, that needs to be polished. They seem okay, but I'll probably have to get them polished anyway. The lobes seem fine. It's just these surfaces here I'm concerned about. So if we look at the cam caps, they don't look too bad. They look pretty fine. This will be the one that is going to be the worst. And yeah, there's a little bit of scratching on there. So I don't really know what to do about that. Probably have to research that in some more detail, whether they are acceptable. But for the small amount of money that's going to be required to get these polished, I'll probably just have the cams polished anyway. Now then, after the cams were removed, the next thing to be removed was this cylinder head, which I've sort of laid out here so we can have a good look at it. Now the previous person that's rebuilt this engine, I know I keep having to moan about their workmanship, but I don't really know what sort of specialist strips head bolts when they put in brand new head bolts into an engine. You'd think that going off the proper torque specs, there shouldn't be any damage done. But as you can see, looking at these bolts, that one's fine, that one's fine. These all come out lovely. Basically, I had some trouble getting some of these bolts out. Now I did manage to get them out in the end, and the sight of me removing the head is not fit for YouTube. It's too horrific. It required me welding and all sorts to get this bolt out. But look at that. Look at this state on that. Now the weld has snapped, which was good because we were able to eventually wind that out. But I welded a bolt to it. The bolt I welded to it snapped when levering. I couldn't get the bit I welded on off, so I had to weld this onto the welded bit. And I had a couple of goes, and eventually we got it off without any damage to the head or the block, which I'm happy to say. But yeah, just goes to show what sort of person really put this engine together. Like, I don't class myself as a specialist or a professional really, but I'm just a DIYer, and I can honestly say I've never stripped a bolt that's gone, you know, a fresh bolt that's gone into an engine. Now then, looking at the cylinder head, it's oily, it's dirty, it's manky, but there's nothing really of concern looking around the cylinder head. Little things, you know, it's like, I believe this is cracked somewhere, which I'd imagine had been re-cracked when the engine was being redone last. And looking inside, we see debris. Now that's probably from when I was trying to undo the head bolts. Although I did cover this, we can see metal and dust inside the head. So this is going to have to be cleaned thoroughly. But there's nothing of concern. All the valves are in place, so I can happily tell you all the valves are in place. And here we see the bottom of the cylinder head. The surface looks okay. There seems to be some weird scratches on there, and leave a mark here, a mark there, but this head gasket hadn't actually failed, so I can't go blaming the head gasket for that. So yeah, I don't really know what that is all about. Now, something I do want your opinion on is the valves. Now look at those valves there. The bottom ones are the intake, the top ones are the exhaust. Bottom intake, top exhaust, same here, same here. But what do you notice about them ones? There's like some sort of coating on the valve, and it's rock hard as well. Now that is the cylinder, I believe, that the lighter spark plug came out of. So are we looking at potentially, when the original engine failed, a faulty injector, perhaps a blocked injector leaning out this cylinder? Because I believe this was the one that cracked originally. So yeah, again, I'd appreciate your input on that. It could be nothing, but it could be a coincidence that a slightly lighter spark plug came out of that one, and also these valves seem to be white, which I'd imagine is from heat. They almost look like they're slightly burnt, but I don't think they are. I think it's some sort of coating. It's because a bit of it's chipped off there, as you can see. So yeah, love to hear your thoughts on that one. Now then, we come to the internals of the engine, and basically the pistons, as you would have heard in the last video, I've labelled them so that they can go right back in without needing a rebore, although they got a bit of dirt on them, probably from when we tried removing the head, maybe a bit of head gasket residue, because the head gasket was like, I don't know, it was just disintegrated into like dust. But yeah, I think that's all the pistons are without damage. But as promised, I'll show you them all individually. They've all got the residue or the dust on them from when I took the head off. So I am planning on reusing these I see no reason to replace 4 brand new pistons which are without damage. Now looking at the con rods is a slightly different story. Now as you know, this would have been the cause of the engine failure really. Well, not necessarily the con rod, but the con rod bearings. Now what's actually happened was the bearing has spun. Now if you don't know what a spun bearing is, basically this bearing here, it sits in this con rod and it's not supposed to rotate. Like the bearing is fixed to the con rod and then the crankshaft goes inside the bearing, and due to oil pressure squirting out of the crankshaft, it sort of floats almost. It's been engineered to have such a minimal play that the bearing doesn't actually come into contact with the crankshaft, and that basically sits in there and we have no problems. Now what happens when you have a spun bearing is, for whatever reason, a variety of reasons, incorrectly installed bearings, all sorts, the bearing actually sticks to the crankshaft and the crankshaft is rotating. So it sticks to the crankshaft and this actually rotates in the con rod. Now that doesn't last very long, and that is what has happened to this one. So if we compare the con rods, we can see, you know, very, very clean, perfectly flat surface, very uniform on both, and it's the same obviously on the appropriate caps to the rods, but this is the one that's spun. And just for the record, I've given all these a good clean with brake cleaner, so that is just the colour of the metal, that's not oil, and very rough. Definitely something quite catastrophic has gone wrong on this rod, so that's going to have to be replaced whatever happens, but thankfully the piston seems to have survived it. Now then, something else I want to show you. Here we have a little sort of display I've set up, and we have the bearing, or at least one half of every bearing from the appropriate con rod that's in front of it. Now if you look at this here, these have all been cleaned with brake cleaner. They don't look ideal, do they? Let's be honest. Like that looks very unevenly worn for a bearing with a couple of 100 miles on. As I said, these bearings should be mirror finish. Even used ones, they shouldn't be coming out looking like that, because they don't really come into contact with the crank. I'm sure they shouldn't look like that. Again, I'm only a DIYer, so I'm not an expert, but I'm pretty sure they shouldn't come out looking like this. Now as we get closer and closer to the left, the bearings get worse and worse. So that one's like, it's not ideal, but I'd expect to see that in something that was like in a car that's, you know, a couple of 100,000 miles old maybe. But looking at it at like 100 miles old, what a state that's in. And they slowly get worse. That one's black. It's got heat marks on it. Remember now, that's like 100 miles old apparently. And then we get to this one, which is the one that's actually failed. The one that was knocking and spun. Now as you can see, that's like a razor blade. And that's actually sat in there, fused itself to the crank and spun around in the con rod. And if we look at the rod cap, you can see that's not much better either. So why has the con rod bearing failed then? Well, I'll be looking at the main bearing soon, and maybe I can give a bit more information then. But yeah, definitely not normal. Possible reasons these have failed. Low oil pressure. Now that's the theory I'm sticking with. Low oil pressure. A mixture perhaps of low oil pressure and also the bearing clearances being too tight, because every single one of them is excessively worn, not just the one that's failed. So perhaps whoever built this engine didn't check the tolerances properly on the crankshaft. That's my theory. Another theory that could contribute to it would be, if this was in the engine, the harmonic balancer on the end of the crankshaft would be here. If this was still assembled, so there'd be that piston, that piston, that piston, that piston. On this end, the harmonic balancer. Now, I don't think this would affect conrod bearings, but I'll have to speak to some people who are more educated than myself. Maybe the harmonic balancer is not balanced. Now, why would I say such a thing? Well, if we look at this here, what do we see? We see chips. Now, this typically happens when someone is playing with an engine and they want to get this off because they've forgotten to take it off. Now, I'm guilty of it. I forgot to take it off when it was in the car or break the nut, so I don't really know what I'm going to do, but I'll find a way. And some people will put mole grips on there in an effort so that when they come to undo it, the mole grips will sort of wedge against something and then they can get leverage on the belt and stop the engine turning. But I think what's happened is they've cracked it and the crank hasn't been balanced as a result, because it's not the only one. Like, there's a big one there as well. So yeah, that's a possible contributing factor. Now, if you remember in my previous video, the turbo's got serious play on it, so I'm thinking perhaps a mixture of low oil pressure, that seems to make the most sense, low oil pressure, and these have been starved. The turbo's also gone in the process, or did these go, and then as a result from bits of metal going through the oil system, the turbo went, and then the cams had excessive wear. It's quite hard to say for certain. Now, here we have the block. Now let's take a little look at the crankshaft. Now, the crankshaft journals, they don't look too bad. Looks pretty flat. I can't feel any scratches with my fingernail on any of these. But obviously, if we look at the spun one, that's extremely worn, and that feels a bit like sandpaper. So not ideal. Now, the crank is savable. I can actually have this crank reground. So what they do is they take a little bit of metal off each one, and to compensate, you can get bearings. You can get these, say, with a 0.2 taken off them, and then you can then get bearings at a 0.2 oversized to compensate. And that's standard practice. Toyota would do that. If this car was still under warranty, they would probably regrind it. So that's something that's not the end of the world. It can be fixed. And another thing as well, when I was actually dismantling these com rods, this one come off lovely, this one come off lovely, this one come off lovely. That one was tight as anything. Now, I wonder, was our rod cap over tightened? Was it over tightened and it bit down on the crank too much? Because there is a torque setting. They have to be at a certain torque setting. And we know that for some reason the bearing is bound on the crank and spun. Was it too tight, or was the fact that the bearing was spun pushing out the cap and increasing the torque as a result? I don't know, but it's a theory that's gone through my mind. Now then, I'll rotate the block around and we'll have a look at the cylinder walls. So here we come to the head of the deck of the block, rather. And you can see that the head gasket residue remains. So it's going to have to be thoroughly cleaned before a new head gasket's been put on it. But if we look at the individual cylinders, we can see they're all in very good condition. There's no scoring. There's nothing. There's only bits of dust really from the head gasket being removed, which is very clearly disintegrated in a paper-like fashion. But yeah, we look through every single cylinder. You can see the cross hatching in every single one. Now I know how things can sometimes look on video, but I can assure you they're all in pretty good nick, and the honing marks seem to be very similar throughout all of them. And one last thing, look at this flywheel. Does that need a regrind? I don't know, what do you think? Here's the old clutch. It just started to get to the rivets. As you can see here, the rivets have started to wear through. So I wouldn't be surprised if it does need to be flattened back a bit. But yeah, I can't believe someone put that clutch into a brand new rebuild car. Bonkers. So I promised you a good look around of the internals of the engine, and yeah, I'm quite pleased, to be honest, with the condition. I thought we were going to have a cracked piston, snapped com rod potentially. I wasn't really sure, but I'm really happy to see that the cylinder walls have survived in such good condition. The pistons have survived, and also 3 out of 4 rods have survived. I did have a little look on eBay, and a replacement rod is only 20-30 quid. I think it's £36 brand new, so not the end of the world when it comes to the rod. Having the crank reground and all the gaskets and that's going to add up. The new clutch, a few bushes in the banana arms I noticed, CV gator, a brake line has got some serious corrosion on it, I noticed, a rubber brake line. So the price is going to add up a bit. I'm estimating around about £800 to £1,000 to put this car road legal and running. But yeah, it's a small price to pay really to get a car like this back on the road. So yeah, hopefully you've enjoyed this video, and I'll see you in the next one, I guess. Cheers guys.